Right. Okay. So based on glancing at the other PowerPoints, I think my presentation is somewhat different from everything else because I'm not really talking about, well, not exactly best practices, but really more research focus. And that's really what I've been working on for quite a while in terms of just like surveying consumers and trying to figure out, what works to improve consumer well-being. And so I do start out talking about regulation, and certainly that's a main focus of this session, but really comparing regulation to other ways to improve consumer well-being. And then I'm going to talk a bit about these topics 2 through 4, just in terms of other possible research areas. But this presentation is really focused on I guess faculty and like graduate students and so forth who might be interested in research related to financial consumer protection, and especially my main focus in that first topic in terms of helping sort of shape consumer research priorities. So in terms of the first area, let's see if I can get this back here. So in the United States, regulation for consumer protection, I think, was generally increasing for many, many decades. I mean, really starting around 1920. And basically, as the decades went by, we had more and more regulation intended to help consumers until about 1980. And then there was a lot of pressure for deregulation. And people like George Stigler really were criticizing regulation of various types, but including regulation that had the stated purpose of protecting consumers. And they focused, these critics focused on the cost of regulation in terms of leading to higher prices, less job growth, less economic growth. And then some economists like George Stigler noted the challenge of, if you have more regulation, you might have regulatory capture by the industries being supposedly being regulated. And certainly there's a history of that in terms of some industries in the United States, like the airline industry and so forth. And then third, these critics pointed out that regulation tends to favor large corporations over small companies. And we've seen this actually many times in the United States, where people in large corporations don't mind regulation because they have large staffs to deal with regulations, and small companies have much more trouble with it. And then fourth, another criticism of regulation is it restricts consumer choices. So you may think, and there's certainly many, many examples of how if we don't have regulation, some consumers are going to be making bad mistakes, maybe they're exploited and so forth. But on the other hand, there are also issues in terms of some consumers will not have, if the regulation is too restrictive, some consumers will be limited in the choices they can make. So these criticisms and some analyses led to a movement toward deregulation in the United States. And I think part of that then was people were starting to think of what are some alternatives to direct regulation. And so some of this is sort of related to regulation. The first section, more information. How do we make sure consumers get more information? And so then there's things like labeling requirements on food and restaurants and so forth, warning labels, things like truth in lending to help make it easier for consumers to choose credit alternatives, and so forth. And we've seen similar things in terms of other areas of consumer choices like insurance and so forth. And then a second alternative regulation that's been discussed a lot, especially in the last 20 years in the United States, is consumer education, and including there's a lot of focus and discussion and efforts and research on financial education. Can financial education help consumers make better choices, and then as sort of a side product, maybe lessen the need for very direct regulation. And then the third alternative to regulation that's been proposed is what's called choice architecture, or nudges. And I'll talk a little more about that later. Interestingly, this last, all of these, actually all three of these alternatives to regulation have been discussed and proposed and advocated under both Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. So in terms of ideology and so forth, it's like, it's not, you know, there's some social political trends that go on even, you know, in the face of the different political tides going one way or the other in the United States anyway. But in any case, these are the three main things in terms of alternatives regulation. And also in terms of my focus on like research, it's like, okay, thinking clearly about these alternatives as well as regulation, I think is a good focus for research. So first of all, going to that first alternative, information, there's been a lot of research in the United States over the past 30 years on trying to analyze what, you know, in terms of information requirements such as labeling and truth in lending, what was the impact on consumer well-being, on prices, on interest rates, on, and then for like diets, it's like, you know, is there any impact in terms of people's health? And a lot of the research authors have had reached sort of skeptical conclusions in terms of, you know, maybe some of these requirements didn't really lead to substantial benefits, or in some cases no significant benefits. And many of the authors have concluded that part of the problem is information overload. You can, you know, even though theoretically it makes sense that if you provide all the information to a consumer about a choice, whether it's nutrition or a financial choice, you know, ideally if we were all perfect computers, we would figure it all out. But a lot of ordinary consumers just don't handle a lot of information well. And so that's, you know, even though there's still things that could help, you know, in the United States, I think actually Sharon Tennyson has written some research related to like some disclosures about credit card terms and so forth. And there's sort of mixed results on that, but it's still a lot of skepticism in terms of how effective information requirements can be. Then consumer education has been very popular. I think part of that maybe is sort of ideological because of, you know, the idea that, well, regulation can be bad for some of the reason, or problematic anyway, for some of the reasons I listed previously. And so consumer education is like, okay, help consumers make better choices, whether it's about safety issues, nutrition, or financial education. And there's some success stories in terms of things like promoting safe sex or getting people to stop smoking. But the nutrition labeling is certainly, doesn't seem to be real strong evidence that providing consumers with a lot more information about nutrition is necessarily going to make them better, healthier. Certainly in the United States, we observe a continuing increase in obesity. And so, you know, you go into a McDonald's and you see the calorie counts for everything, but that doesn't stop people from eating too much. So, and then financial education is appealing partly because there's some problems in terms of regulation, and because consumers have very diverse goals. And so it's hard to sort of target regulation to really make all, you know, most consumers better off. So, you know, there's been a lot of effort on financial education, financial literacy, and so forth in the United States over the past decades, and some research that tries to assess the value. One interesting article that if you're interested in financial literacy and financial education, I highly recommend, and that's an article that appeared in the Iowa Law Review by someone named Lauren Willis. It's called Against Financial Literacy Education. And it may be of interest partly because it's really her basic thesis is financial education, financial literacy education doesn't really work well, and maybe we should have regulations. So, you know, if you get into a discussion with somebody about, well, maybe financial education will be an alternative to regulation. Her viewpoint, and I don't agree with a lot of what she says, but on the other hand, I think she raises a lot of useful points to think about, is that it's just too difficult, and she gives this is a quote from her article saying, basically the U.S. Department of Labor has a booklet on trying to help people plan for retirement, which is a very important topic, but it has like 62 pages and 8 worksheets, and the ordinary consumer would just find it really difficult. I mean, I find it difficult with my seniors in my undergraduate retirement planning course to teach them all this, and they have my they are motivated because they want to pass my course. And so she concludes it's implausible that financial literacy education could impart the knowledge and comprehension and skills consumers need to do what society and marketplaces currently demand. So there's a lot more examples in this article, but certainly one of the issues that she raises and other people have raised really is the increasing complexity of household financial decisions. And certainly I'm most familiar with that in the United States, but it's like, it used to be that a lot of workers could have like a good defined benefit pension, and maybe their employer provided them with good insurance. And so they could get by without making complex decisions, except maybe with the home mortgage. And used to be that home mortgages used to be pretty simple. But a lot of workers now have extremely complex decisions to make in terms of planning for retirement, how much to contribute, investing, thousands of investment alternatives and so forth. And so maybe, and this is Lauren Willis's point, maybe it's beyond the cognitive abilities for many, many people. And financial education, a lot of efforts in the United States, but progress seems to be very limited. The National Financial Capability Survey has been administered since 2009, and they found that in a simple set of financial literacy questions that Anna Marie Lusardi helped design, the percent who got at least 4 out of 5 questions right among those who are 18 to 34 decreased from 30% got 4 out of 5 right in 2009 to down to 17%. So, and this is despite a lot of efforts in high schools, colleges, and general population to try to promote financial education. So it's sort of a pessimistic result in terms of that effort. And so certainly one of the things I would suggest in terms of thinking about financial education, financial literacy education, is thinking about different financial decisions in terms of how complex are there, and are some of the decisions consumers have to make so complex that education is just not going to work for most of them. So when is regulation needed rather than financial education? This organization had a conference in June, and one of the presenters, Martin Say, talked about research he's done on mortgage choices with interest-only mortgages, and it's hard to get people to really understand them. So one alternative would be to say to ban that type of mortgage in the United States. I would be conflicted on that because I like the idea of having consumers having choices, but this is a policy issue and a research issue that people should think about. And then choice architecture, or nudges, I think would be yet another alternative to regulation. And there's a book highly recommended for everybody, is by Thaler and Sunstein, Nudge: Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. So they have lots and lots of examples of decisions that consumers have to make that they would argue, are just too complex for education to work. And on the other hand, they're both somewhat have libertarian tendencies, even though Sunstein was actually in charge of some regulatory agency in the President Obama's administration, but still they proposed nudging or choice architecture as alternatives to direct regulation. And so they have lots of examples. There's some skepticism about their proposals, but certainly that's something to consider. And there are successes in that arena in terms of, for instance, retirement choices, having default retirement choices that in retirement plans offered by corporations. Then just briefly, a few other topics I wanted to touch upon in terms of research. And again, this is more of the research than the regulation, but one interesting area of research lately that I've worked on with some graduate students is overconfidence. And so some financial education has tried to promote both objective consumer financial knowledge and people's confidence. But there have been a number of recent studies that found that overconfidence by consumers can lead to poor decisions. Then another interesting topic to me anyway on research is endogeneity of financial literacy. How do people become financially literate, financially knowledgeable? And this is an important question for research because people, to some extent, people learn by doing. And so then that, in terms of the research, causality becomes a little more complicated because of you know, you can't say, well, financial literacy leads to better financial choices, and if to some extent over time the reverse is happening, that better, you know, having certain types of financial experiences leads to better financial knowledge. So anyway, that's just sort of an interesting question. And then finally, something I've just started working on recently is on special issues for immigrants. And you know, there's certainly a lot of evidence in the U.S. and a few other countries that immigrants overall are worse off because they're less, obviously, tend to be less familiar with the financial system in their new country. And this is going to be a huge issue potentially in the next 50 years, as some countries in Europe and in Asia are going to have massive decreases in population, but there's going to be increased pressure for more immigration. So what's going to happen in terms of immigrants coming into the new country? So just basically to recap, I think these issues, and I spent obviously most of my time talking about this first one, are going to be, I think, fruitful areas for future research related to consumer financial protection. So that's it. Thank you.